Okay, I want to start out. How many of you work for a nursery or a garden center? Raise your hand. Okay, there are a few of you. And I want to say something that don't take this as critical, but actually what you need to realize is how important you are for getting information and the right information to your customers. I did a survey probably about 5 years ago, and it was about power line pruning and what people thought about the look of it and about the people who do that work. But at the end, I always ask questions about how people get educated, how they learn about landscapes, and then how they prefer to learn, things like that. Well, I had a list of educational sources, so places or people that they could go for tree information in particular. I gave them that list, and they could check all the boxes that they used that source to get tree information. And what would you think the highest source was? It was 78% of the people used it. Nurseries and garden centers, because they're coming to you to buy products, to buy plants, and so you're critical. You're the easiest place for them to go. Extension offices are a little harder to access sometimes. Extension was, I think, about third on the list, and they were at about 50% use. Then I asked what their trust was of the source. And they could, I think I had them just say complete trust, high trust, low trust, no trust. Who do you think had the highest trust? It was extension offices or extension personnel. The lowest was family. The second low, and it was like 5% or less. The second lowest and down nearly that low were friends. And third lowest, below 10%, were nurseries and garden centers. So they come to you, but they don't necessarily trust what they're learning. Now, they don't really know. Most of these people, I also ask them how much they know about trees, and they don't know much. And they don't even think they know much. So they don't necessarily know whether they should trust the information they're getting from you or not. But the point is, you're critical to getting the right information out there because you're on the front lines. And ever since I identified that need, I've been looking for a place where I could talk to some nursery and garden center people who are on the front lines, and this is a good opportunity. So I'm glad I could be here today. I'm going to pass this around. I'll get to something that would refer to how this kind of thing might happen, but just look at it. This would be an example. This didn't die. This was dug up for some other reason, but there's a good chance it was going to die in 8 years or so, maybe 10 years, because of girdling roots. This side might have saved it. It might have had some roots that would have stayed alive, and the trunk might have not have died, but these certainly were going to do it in as they grew in diameter. So I just want to pass that around, give you something to look at so you don't have to look at me. Okay, so I want to talk about some things you should know about trees, and I started with 10 things you should know about trees because 10 always seems like a good number. It's Letterman's, what does he do? Top 10. But I could only come up with 7 that I could fit, and I'm not even sure I'll get to all these. But the first thing is the right tree in the right place. Lots of times for trees and shrubs, you're helping people, and even those who aren't in nurseries and garden centers, you may be making decisions on what tree or shrub to choose. And the main thing I want to point out here is there's lots of possible reasons or things to consider: size, shape, shade tolerance, tolerance of high soil pH, which is important in most of the West where it doesn't rain much, because we tend to have high soil pH, and trees tend to like low soil pH. Moisture obviously is limiting to us. The growth rate, people tend to want fast-growing trees, And for the most part, you should be recommending medium growth and slow growing trees, because fast growing trees almost always have serious problems and get too big. People want a fast growing tree that only gets so big, and there's problems with that. Flowers, fruit, aesthetics, lots of reasons people might want a certain tree, and you need to know enough about the tree and about how trees react to their site that you can help narrow things down. And then I wanted to point out some resources. The Tree Browser is a website we've got, just treebrowser.org. You don't need the W's. That you can actually look at on your smartphones as well as, or iPads or whatever, as well as on the full-size computer. And it has 240 maybe tree species in it, and you can narrow down by characteristics you pick. So if you want just trees with ornamental flowers, then you can choose that characteristic. It'll narrow the list down, and then you can browse through the ones that it came up with and see which ones you actually want. There's photos for most of them, descriptions of all of them, and you can stack those choices too. You can make 3 or 4 choices and come up with just the 16 or the 25 or whatever trees that meet your criteria. The Extension Forestry website that we have, forestry.usu.edu, has lots of tree selection and tree identification resources on it, as well as tree care resources. A book I wrote a number of years ago now, it's probably 16 years ago, Trees of Utah and the Intermountain West, still available. You can get it through Amazon or sometimes local bookstores. And then there's places to go to learn about trees, and places you might want to go, but also that you can refer people to. And the number one would be Arboreta, places like the Utah Botanical Center, which is getting was a small arboretum, and it's growing, which is great, on the south side of the property. That's up in Kaysville. There's also a couple of arboreta really at the University of Utah. The main campus, especially down, I don't know what they call that, the horseshoe down by the administration building on the lower part of campus. There's an arboretum there, and there's a booklet you can get with a list of the trees. There's also, of course, Red Butte Gardens up high, where they have a lot of woody plant material. And then BYU has an arboretum, and USU has an arboretum. Really, USU, it's the whole campus. I think BYU, that may be as well. And then the Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District, they call it the Conservation Garden Park, and they've got a lot of good examples of plant material growing under different water regimens. And you can look those up on the web. And I just wanted to mention a few bad choices. So trees that, a few of these you shouldn't be planting and selling at all. In other cases, you should just minimize your use or really look specifically for opportunities where the tree makes sense, but it doesn't make sense in a lot of cases. And aspen is a good example of that. Aspen, everybody wants them because they love the aspens up in the mountains. You're not going to grow those aspens down in the valleys. You're going to get something else. And even though it's the same species, it just doesn't do well with the heat and low humidities in the valleys. It also gets chlorosis sometimes. Of course, you get the sprouts in the yard. And a lot of that doesn't happen at high elevations or with the sprouting. That's how aspen regenerates up high for the most part, rather than from seed. But of course, in our cultivated landscapes, it's a real pain. Who hasn't had somebody ask them how to get rid of the aspen sprouts but not get rid of the aspens? Willows, cottonwoods, poplars, same family as aspen, the Salicaceae, the willow family. And these are trees and shrubs that kind of have a James Dean approach to life. Grow fast, reproduce, die young. And the problem with that is in our landscapes, we'd like something usually that would last a little longer and be higher quality and not take so much care while we've got it. They get decayed because they put no energy into protecting themselves from decay. They put no energy into protecting themselves from insects. They just say, bring it on, because I'm not going to be here all that long. My offspring will carry on. So they have lots of problems. Norway maple, we really, it's not a terrible weed in Utah. If you talk to people from the northeastern U.S., they're amazed that we're allowed to plant it, because it's a noxious weed in much of the Northeast. It's not too much of a weed in Utah, although if you've got Norway maples around, you certainly have Norway maple seedlings. It is up Logan Canyon. I don't know these Wasatch Front canyons that well, but I'd be surprised if there isn't a little bit of it. But more than being a weed, besides the fact that it is somewhat weedy, it's just not that good a tree. You get a lot of dieback in it. Seems really sensitive to any opening up of the crown. You'll get dead spots on the trunks, and I know what I speak of because I have 7 Norway maples, and I didn't plant any of them, but I haven't really found a good way to get rid of them. I should have done that 21 years ago when I moved into my house, but I'm living with them. Silver maple. Chlorosis, weak wood, grows too fast. I wouldn't even mention silver maple in Cache Valley because nobody grows it. But in the Ogden area especially, there's a lot of silver maples. And it is fast growing, so I guess that's hard to argue with. But besides the fast growth, it's weak wooded, which often goes with fast growth. And it regularly gets iron chlorosis. That's just par for the course for having silver maple. Because of its heritage, autumn blaze, the cultivars of autumn blaze, which are crosses between red maple and silver maple, also are pretty suspect. And yet it was the tree of the year in the nursery industry maybe a decade ago, and it gets planted a lot. There's a lot of different crosses between those two species. But because it's got silver maple in it, it grows awful fast, and chlorosis is very likely. Russian olive and tamarisk are trees that shouldn't be planted at all. And in the Uinta Basin, it's illegal to plant them, and it's illegal not to cut them down and remove them if you have them, because they're noxious weeds. I don't think anybody gets ticketed for that, but they are aggressive weeds in much of Utah. Spruce, I really like spruces, and I'm not saying don't plant spruces, but you shouldn't plant spruces where you're going to xeriscape, where you're going to cut back on water. And if you have good-sized spruces, you're taking a big chance if you don't water them well, because blue spruce and Norway spruce in particular have really suffered in the valleys in the last 10 to 12 years, maybe a little longer than that, where people started cutting back on their water, which was a responsible thing to do because we live in a semi-desert, but they didn't realize that the spruces need a good amount of water, and then Ips beetles attacked and took out a lot of big spruces. And the people who made the decision not to water them much wouldn't have made that decision had they known they would lose their spruce trees. So spruces, you got to have enough water. And then lindens, again, lindens are okay trees, but you got to give them enough water. Lindens in the Salt Lake Valley just look like heck in August. You know, they'll have almost none of their green leaf left because of leaf scorch. There are better lindens and worse lindens. Silver lindens a little better, but one problem with linden in general is it's just overplanted. People like the conical form, and I think we could probably cut back on lindens, and we'll still have plenty of lindens for quite some time. By the way, in my yard, I have 7 Norway maples. I've had 1 silver maple, but I had it cut down. I don't have any, let's see, I don't have any spruce, and I have 2 lindens. And I had a big aspen. So maybe I've just got an attitude about trees I didn't plant. Okay, by the roots, not the top. So focus on the root system. By far the most important part of the tree is the root system. And if you're buying a tree, that's what you should look at first. The top, it's easy to see if there's problems, and a lot of those problems are easy to correct, but if you're buying a bad root system, you're not going to have a tree that survives. Root systems are wide and shallow. You know, I said we're going to cover like 7 things you should know about trees, but there's a lot of little things within each of these you should know about. And root systems are wide and shallow. Typical tree root systems will be this deep, like 90% of the roots in this depth, and will go out well beyond what people talk about as the drip line, the edge of the canopy or the edge of the crown. And when you purchase a tree, most of the roots have been cut off. If it's a bald and burlap tree especially, grown in the nursery in an outdoor bed, when they lift it, they've cut off most of the roots, maybe 90%. And so to get enough root, the rule of thumb is you should have 10 to 12 inches of root ball diameter for every inch of trunk caliper, that diameter of the stem right where it goes in the ground. And then bald and burlap trees currently are much better trees than potted trees. And I think we'll be living with that for some time till the nursery industry figures out how to grow better root systems in pods. And so the root system's wide and shallow. I'll show a few pictures to illustrate some of these things. So there's a spruce tree in this spruce forest. That tree right there, that the bottom is there. And this spruce tree was excavated. They took the duff, the organic matter layer, off so they could expose the roots. And that's an interesting thing all by itself. They took the organic matter off. They didn't dig. They just took off the needles and the twigs, and the roots were there. Most of the roots of this forest were laying right on top of the ground and growing right under the duff, which would be the mulch layer if you mulched the tree in your landscape. And so it shows how shallow the roots were. Nearly all the roots were like that. And then to show how wide-spreading they are, I've photoshopped this so you can see it a little better. That's one root that they exposed and then painted white so they could take a picture to illustrate how shallow this was and how wide it was. So it's laying on top of the ground and snaking out through the woods, crossing over the root flare of another spruce tree, and going out 20 meters in one direction. So maybe 65, 70 feet in one direction. And the tree was probably about 20 feet wide. So one root, one way, meaning probably 140-foot root system diameter for a 20-foot or less diameter tree crown, for the crown. So roots are very shallow and very wide, and that ends up affecting a lot of how people should think about things they're doing in landscapes, like trenching and things that will cause compaction. Just back to the bald and burlapped being superior so far to potted trees. Bald and burlap trees are in soil from the nursery, dug with a tree spade usually, lifted, and then put into a basket that'll have burlap, and it's all tied up with cords and nails. And the advantage it has over potted trees is you don't have too much root material, and root material that is in orientations that are going to cause problems later. You can actually end up with trees like that one I was passing around due to being potted and circling roots in the pot. I think that tree was actually put into a hole in very compacted soil, and the roots grew out and then grew around. But you're much less likely to have those circling roots and girdling roots with a balled and burlap tree. It's not guaranteed, but it's better. This is a large potted tree that I bought for a workshop, and where we were going to talk about root collar excavation and root system, root washing, to where you can spread out some of these circling roots. But it was almost impossible to do with this tree. It had so much root material circling. That entire brown area, you're not seeing any potting mix there. You're seeing just roots that are mostly growing horizontally. And we probably spent 40 minutes trying to wash that root system out to get it spread out a little, and we never could. Another problem with potted trees is most of them are coming into nurseries now, or coming to you as landscapers, with deeply buried root collars. The root collar is where the stem goes into the ground and flares out into the root system naturally. That should be right at the surface of the soil. And even in balled and burlap trees, we're finding that those root collars are buried a few inches to maybe up to 8 to 10 inches deep, but it's much more common with potted material. And at least some people have told me that it's because they'll pot up whips of bare root stuff in the nursery, in the production nursery, and pot it deep for support. I don't know all the reasons why it might be. Sometimes in a tree this big, it's being repotted several times, so there's a lot of opportunities to put it in too deep. Balled and burlap trees, it seems like what's happening is there's cultivation going on, and soil's being thrown into the row and builds up along the stem. Then when you dig the tree with a normal tree spade, you're actually leaving much of the root system in the ground because you're not really digging deep enough, because you've got maybe this much overburden on top of the root ball. But still, they're better than potted. So don't plant a $10 tree in a $1 hole, and this is just to get at several points about planting. If you're planting trees or advising people on planting trees, a few things that are important: plant shallow. Roots need oxygen, and also you want that root collar at the surface. Expose the root collar. If you've bought a tree that has a buried root collar, find the root collar, get rid of that overburden, and bring that root collar up to the surface. If the root collar is buried half or more, and I'd say more like even 25% or more, deep in the pot or deep in the root ball, I would consider rejecting that tree or taking it back to the nursery. It's not being produced according to nursery standards, and the nursery industry is working on it, but I'm not sure where they are with fixing the problem. Yeah, that's bad. If it has started to grow roots in it, I think I wouldn't do anything. It's probably too late, and you just cross your fingers. It's bad practice. You shouldn't pile soil on top of existing established trees, because you're cutting the oxygen down here where most of the roots are, and you're going to start killing roots due to that. No, I would just treat them as that's the new soil level. But if you're not finding roots in that, and especially if it was recently done, take it off. Yeah. But if there's roots in it, I think there's too much chance you're going to do a fair amount of damage. Yeah. If the roots have grown up, though, and aren't attached to the trunk, that's tough, too, because you don't want to disrupt the root system. What it's going to try to do is grow roots up like this. And so if you're cutting many roots, if they're attached to the trunk, don't do anything. If they're not attached to the trunk, you might excavate a cone around the trunk, because the moist soil against that trunk that's not producing roots will eventually cause wounding and decay in the trunk. Relieve compaction if you have it, or try to avoid compaction, because that reduces oxygen movement into the soil. Don't overwater, and I really don't like weed barrier fabrics. They don't work that good. They end up being a mess, and and they also interfere with oxygen movement into the soil. So this is really what root systems are like, although soil's been washed off this, so you don't necessarily want all the roots laying on top, but that's kind of what root systems of trees naturally are like. And this is often what we end up with because we don't dig holes wide enough. And sometimes we have a root system like this from the nursery that's already this way when we put it in the ground, and it just grows in diameter. And eventually those roots grow in diameter, the trunk grows in diameter. When they meet 10 or 15 years down the road, you get a girdling root situation, and the trunk dies, declines slowly, and then dies. And you may find no sign of insects or diseases and wonder what happened, and sometimes this is what happened. If you find an established tree and the trunk's going straight into the ground, and when you push on it, you see a fair amount of movement down below, yet the tree's been in 5 or 10 years, and especially if when you push on it, you're pushing soil away, kind of opening up a cone, and you know it's pivoting from deep in the soil, well, that means the root collar is somewhere deep, and it was buried either in the nursery or when the tree was planted. So I don't mean plant shallow, like just stick the tree on the ground and let it grow. This is a Douglas fir landscape tree in Oregon where I lived for a year, and they had actually set it out there in the pot, and it rooted through the holes in the bottom of the pot, but we can't usually get away with that. But this hole is too narrow, and yet this would be really common. You know, dig that hole just big enough for the tree. Sometimes you can tell people are eyeballing the tree and digging a hole that'll be the exact size, so they don't have to do any backfilling. But what you should do, this picture is too extreme for most production. Although if you had a really compacted front yard, let's say, the more you can dig up, the better. But we're recommending at least 3 times the root ball diameter. So that means the root ball itself plus 1 times the diameter all the way around. Because that loosened up soil that's going to be surrounding your root ball is going to welcome roots instead of repel them. Let's see, some other points. If you did have a really compacted site, you could do tilling or digging around farther out to loosen things up. If you have really compacted clay, kind of greasy, smooth clay when you dig, you may want to roughen up the sides of that hole, and again, you want to go wide. That's probably what happened with that tree I passed around. It was put into a really hard clay and a small hole. Remove excess soil on top of the ball, expose that root collar. The hole as deep as the root ball or a little shallower, bring the root ball up a little. Don't bury the root ball. Even if you expose the root collar, you don't want the root ball in the middle of a dish like this because most of our landscapes are actually too wet, not too dry. And you want undisturbed soil under the root ball. You don't want to dig it up and then compact it and then put the root ball down because when it gets wet, it'll sink in. This tree was a bald and burlap tree, and it turned out when we opened it up and peeled off the soil at the top that was extra soil, it was that far deep. So that was where the burlap had been. The root collar was down there. And bald and burlap trees are better than potted in that regard. So just shows how bad it was. Remove root ball packing materials as much as possible. The more, the better. It doesn't really matter underneath the root ball, but as much as you can on the sides. If you're not going to remove the burlap on the sides, don't peel the burlap off the top and push it down into the hole. At least cut it off at the soil surface, but the farther you go down, the better. I don't really care about removing wire baskets, but removing the wrapping materials actually is more important, I think, because they can interfere eventually with root growth. A single layer of burlap isn't that big a deal. Roots will grow right through it, but if you wad it up in the hole, you're going to hinder root growth. And you see lots of nurseries or lots of landscapes like this where nothing's been removed. And then use native soil backfill. You can put some compost in it if you have like a lot of rock, but otherwise just the soil on the site, because that's what the tree's going to have to survive in. And do backfill. This was a case of digging a hole just exactly the shape of the root ball and dropping the root ball in. And I could actually put my hand under that and reach all the way under the tree. And roots really won't grow very well across voids. You want to pack that soil down against the root ball and against the hole. And of course, if you don't dig a deep enough hole, you won't have room. Mulch. Don't mulch too much. Trees are just big weeds, so remember when you sell a broadleaf herbicide, it's going to kill dandelions, but it'll also affect broadleaf trees as well. So I'm trying to get people to like spot use herbicides. If they want to control dandelions, don't spray it over the entire landscape or the entire lawn, because the tree is a big weed to the herbicide. Fertilizers. Trees are very good at surviving on low nutrient soils. You can push growth a little bit, but most trees don't need growth pushed. We end up with trees too big in landscapes oftentimes anyway. Trees feed themselves. They don't need you to feed them. And trees have mycorrhizae. They're fungi that grow on the root systems, grow out into the soil, and actually make nutrients available to the tree in exchange for food from the tree. And these are what those mycorrhizal fungi strands look like as they go out through the soil. And actually chanterelles and certain other mushrooms we eat and that you find in forests are the fruiting bodies of mycorrhizal fungi. So trees can handle very low nutrient conditions because of that. When you prune, don't leave stubs, don't make flush cuts, and don't use wound dressings. This is a pretty good pruning cut, and after a year you know you made a good cut if you have a nice ring of callus all around. And topping is bad because you end up with decay, fast growth, and breakage. And finally, trees don't heal, they seal. So when they get wounds, the wound stays inside them, but they wall it off and cover it over. And this explains why you get stuff like this inside a tree, but often you get new good wood on the outside, and that decay inside may even make a void eventually, an opening, but the tree will, if it has time, will close that over and be strong. Let's see, so that was the last, just irrigation. Most trees need 20 to 40 inches a year, the trees we grow in our landscapes. We don't get that in the valleys here very often, so we need to irrigate. And just a few things about irrigating. Don't saturate for a long time. Try to water less often but greater volume. And it's really hard to properly irrigate a big tree with a drip system because you need lots of emitters. Because you have to encourage a wide root system the way it wants to grow its roots. So there's my contact information.